William Gerald Golding was born on September 19, 1911. His earliest memory was of color, red mostly, he would say, but everywhere and the sense of wind blowing, buffeting, and there was much light. And together with this was an awareness, an unadulterated sense of self, which saw as you might with the lens of your eyes removed. Whether this was actually a memory of his own birth or a later imagination, he could not be positive, but it makes for a good beginning to the story of a life. Welcome to House of Words, a podcast about writers, islands, and dreams. I am your host, Jason Nemore Hardin, inviting you to join us as we look at one of the most famous books in the world of literature. This is William Golding's Lord of the Flies. There were relatively few books written especially for children at the time William was young, so he had to make do with what he could find. Among the authors he enjoyed were Victor Hugo, Jules Verne, Mark Twain, Robert Louis Stevenson, Rider Haggard, Alexander Dumas, and Conan Doyle. Now, according to his brother Joseph, one book that William read numerous times was Nat the Naturalist, or A Boy's Adventures in the Eastern Seas by prolific author of boys' adventure stories George Manville Fenn. The book was purchased for William on his 7th birthday by his parents. Now, he thinks, though without being sure, that he was taken to hear Polish piano player and composer Paderewski play when he was roughly 11 or 12 years old. However, such outings were rare, partly because his parents were poor, and partly because his parents associated anything theatrical with being sexual, and therefore felt uneasy about it. Among the few outings he does remember is when his mother took him to the musical comedy Chu Chin Chow. He was just a very small boy. Young William was impressed by the moonlight scene. Another was seeing Harriet Jay's comedy When Nights Were Bold, which made him laugh so hard that he fell off of his seat. And there was also a third play, title unknown, about two astronauts who go to Mars in an aeroplane and find that Martians sing and dance in Spangles. Now, he was captivated by the theater. Now, recalling it later in life, he seems to harbor a grudge against his parents for cutting him off from the stage and the potential career it might have offered him. Cinema was also an unspeakable pleasure of his that his parents disapproved of. Nevertheless, he went to Saturday matinees to watch silent movies where cowboys and Indians, explorers, naval battles, and murder mysteries set in derelict houses gave him nightmares. Interestingly enough, he always sat alone in the middle row in the front, partly because his parents disliked him mixing with other children, also because he did not want to mix with other children. All in all, his childhood, as he describes it in his unpublished journals and memoirs, could not be called happy. He was oversensitive, timid, lonely, fearful, also imaginative to the point of hallucination. He was alienated from his parents and his brother and practically had no friends. Now, looking back on his childhood, however, things did look sunnier, as in the first of his Ewing lectures, delivered at the University of California in Los Angeles in 1961, he observed that the best writers are supposed to have had unhappy childhoods, stating that his was, generally speaking, a very happy one. Now, one of his earliest happy memories was finding his father standing in the garden, in the dark, on the west lawn, looking up at the stars. Young William heard his father murmuring to himself, "I wonder," and asked him, "What do you wonder?" "I just wonder. It's all I can do," his father replied. "I shall go on wondering for the rest of my life." This incident gave William an image of what man ought to be, a watcher and a wanderer. In September 1921, at 10 years old, William started at Marlborough Grammar School. By this time, his older brother Joseph, who went by the nickname Jose, was already a star student there. It didn't make it any easier that his father was a teacher there as well. Now, despite the pressure one might assume William felt, he seemed to have held his own. As a student at Marlborough, he was also able to observe his father's teaching style firsthand, which was nothing short of a performance. Like an actor, he lectured and gestured so intensely, bringing lessons to life for his students. Quote, before the Second World War, I believed in the perfectibility of social man, that a correct structure of society would produce goodwill, and that therefore you could remove all social ills by a reorganization of society. But after the war, I did not, because I was unable to. I had discovered what one man could do to another. I must say that anyone who moved through those years without understanding that man produces evil as a bee produces honey must have been blind or wrong in the head. End quote. In the autumn of 1945, William Golding returned home after serving nearly 5 years in the Royal Navy and went back to his teaching job at Bishop Wordsworth School in Salisbury. He had married Anne Brookfield in 1939, and just before his war tour, they became pregnant. By the time he returned, his son David was 5 years old. Now, shortly following his return, his daughter Judith was born. Now, as happened with most young men, war changed William. His brother-in-law Richard described him as less approachable, less outgoing, and more critical. Now, having to return to teaching seemed to be an aggravator as well. Now, William, contrary to his father, very much disliked teaching, not simply because he wanted to be a writer, but also because when he thought about it on any level deeper than the routine of being a teacher, he didn't know what it was for. Towards the end of his life, he wrote, I never knew what education was about. Of course, I could have lectured on it every day of the week if asked, firing off the usual bromides like a vaguely healthy smell. But while I was really teaching children, I could never have told an eager inquirer what the practical point of my endeavors was supposed to be. Now, he was troubled by guilt about his incompetence, as well as his lack of commitment. However, he was unqualified for any other job and had a growing family to support. They were poor and lived in what Golding called a lousy council flat, so the options were few, and thus it was what it was. Inevitably, the dissatisfaction he felt was shared by his pupils. The room where he usually taught had a narrow aisle between the blackboard and the front desks that extended along the side by the door, forming an L. As a stern teacher, his regular practice would be to enter the room, tell the class to continue with some task, and then walk back and forth along the L for the rest of the lesson. Sometimes he would have a volume of Greek literature in his hand and would read as he walked. Sometimes he would laugh or simply talk to himself. Then there was his curmudgeon demeanor. His mannerisms as a teacher being what they were, William Golding stood firm on his literary dream, and wouldn't you know it, persistence and determination would prove to be the light at the end of the tunnel. Quote, even if you got rid of the paper, you would still have storytellers. In fact, you had the storytellers before you had the paper. End quote. At school, Golding's nickname among the pupils was Scruff, alluding to his unkempt hair and beard, a beard stained yellow from nicotine. Einstein in the last week of his life, one student went on to describe him. He wore baggy corduroy trousers and a shapeless Harris tweed jacket, and the gown he sometimes wore appeared to consist largely of holes held together by bits of once black material turned green with age. He was a walking contrast to the formal suits worn by the other teachers. In breaks and during lunch, he would sit apart from the other teachers, learning Greek or later scribbling in notebooks. This behavior led to endless leg pulling from his fellow colleagues. How's the masterpiece coming on? They would ask rhetorically. He seemed to take it all in good spirit at the time. It was a demon, however, he would later exercise in the radio play Break My Heart, broadcast in 1966. The play was set in a school and featured a teacher called Jerry, who never speaks, but sits in a corner of the staff room trying to write novels, and is mocked by his colleagues for his literary ambition. Although many students found Golding neglectful, it must be stressed that many others did not. For some, he was a true educator who provoked them into thought instead of trying to cram them with facts. Both in English and religious knowledge, he would question the boys about their own insights and perceptions. In philosophical and political discussions, he would use role play, getting students to defend particular viewpoints. These exercises and discussions provided Golding with insights that were valuable for his future work, most obviously concerning Lord of the Flies. Now, it occurred to more than one student that Golding stirred up antagonism between them in order to observe their reactions. And when delivering the second Ewing lecture at the University of California in Los Angeles in 1961, he confessed that he had learned to understand the nature of small boys with awful precision, because he had introduced a certain measure of experimental science into his teaching of them. He decided to see what would happen if they were given more liberty. He removed the restraining pressure of adult life. Well, I gave them more liberty, and I gave them more liberty, and more, and more, and more. I drew further away. And though he did not go precisely into what happened with his experiment, he hinted that this liberty escalated into the real and present danger that someone could have been killed. He added, "Give me liberty or give me death." Well, it was a point where these were no longer simple alternatives. Quote, "I suppose you can say I've been effectively writing since I was 35. I published my first book, or had my first book published, a book of verse, when I was 19. I just want to forget that one. Nobody knows anything about it. And then, out of the rest, you've got to take 5 years for the wary in the Navy, and then 10 years, perhaps learning to write by imitating other people, and learning very late that, of course, I was merely writing other people's novels instead of my own. And it was not until I was 37, I suppose, that I grasped the great truth that you've got to write your own books and nobody else's. Then everything followed from that." End quote. William Golding considered the idea of writing about what one knows as somewhat inaccurate. He considered that a lot of the fun of writing was exploring precisely the things that you don't think you can do. After all, he had never been drowned, and he had never been flung up on a rock, never been to hell, in so many words. "Writing is not reportage, but imagination," he would say. "Therefore, I don't think you ever write about what you know about. You write about what you guess about and what you imagine about. This is one way of doing it." And the inspiration for Lord of the Flies came from reading to David and Judy at bedtime. The books they read, Treasure Island, Coral Island, The Swiss Family Robinson, were, as stated in the names of said books, often about islands. And one winter evening, after they had put the children to bed and after reading yet another of these books, William and Anne were sitting by the fire in what he would refer to as a state of complete parental exhaustion. Now, he expressed to his wife how tired he was of bad writing and how he was playing with the idea of writing a book about boys on an island to see if he couldn't make a more realistic presentation of what would happen to them. Well, Anne thought it seemed like a great idea, and so he immediately grabbed a piece of paper and started working on the story. Now, concerning how he works out the story, he replied to an interviewer that he plans his novels from the beginning to end before he starts on a draft. Every detail is well thought out, almost until the last flick of an eyelid, he would say. Now, he compared his method to how a painter visualizes what he intends on creating and then makes it happen with strokes of a brush. Well, likewise, he would plan out, visualize, if you will, the structure of the story and write it as such. A Lord of the Flies arrived in 2 such pictures. One picture was of a little boy standing on his head in the sand, delighted to be on a real coral island at last, while the other was of the same little boy being hunted down like a pig by the savages the children had turned into. Now, he saw that what he had to do was join the 2 pictures, and then the story would start to flow naturally on its own. Now, his private memories of the book's composition, recorded in his journal, make it sound less easy. Writing it had been, as he put it, right on the edge of the impossible. He noted that he'd dredged around for conversation. It seems that though the dialogue proved difficult, the local color was pure pleasure for him. He would say, "One thing that none of the critics know is how far such enjoyment as I got from writing the book stemmed from being on a coral island, hence the elaborate description of natural phenomena." Now, in all, the first draft with corrections and edits of Lord of the Flies took about 3 or 4 months, but there would be additional changes and rewrites once a publisher got involved. Quote, "What are we? Humans or animals? Or savages?" End quote. The novel's original title, under which Golding sent it out to publishers, was not Lord of the Flies, but Strangers from Within. It went first to Jonathan Cape Publishing, who returned it, writing that it regretfully did not seem to them that Golding had been wholly successful in working out a promising idea. They did, however, suggest he try his luck with Andre Deutsch. No luck there either. The rejections piled up. Then, on the 14th of September, 1953, he sent his tattered typescript to Faber and Faber. And the professional reader employed by Faber and Faber to assess new works of fiction was a lady called Polly Perkins. Now, having read or at least looked at Golding's typescript, she recorded her harsh verdict in the corner of his letter. Time, the future, absurd and uninteresting fancy about the explosion of an atom bomb on the colonies. A group of children who land in jungle country near New Guinea. Rubbish and dull. Pointless. Now, this assessment is followed by an R in a circle, signifying that it was rejected. And that would have been that if a certain Charles Monteith had not intervened. A future legendary publisher himself, in 1953, he was just starting out. Now, Golding was his first catch, though when he picked the typescript of Strangers from Within out of the reject pile one Tuesday afternoon in late September 1953, he was, to begin with, by no means sure just how much of a catch it truly was. It had a dog-eared, shop-soiled look, and the first dozen or so pages were yellowish at the edges, showing that they at least had been read a number of times, and the remainder were wider, clearly illustrating where interest had waned. Now, the first pages described a nuclear war and contained no characters at all. Later, attention switched earthwards, where there was a hurriedly organized evacuation of school children. Now, the planes they flew had detachable cabins, aka passenger tubes, which could float to Earth beneath giant parachutes. Then the focus switched to a particular plane, then to a fierce air battle over the Pacific, then to the release of the passenger tube, then to a tropical island, and at last to some humans who were all boys. Now, as Monteith continued to read, and particularly after he read beyond those rather unfocused first pages, he found that he was increasingly gripped. The island was brilliantly real, and the boys seemed to be real boys. Now, having been a fat, spectacled boy at school himself, Monteith squirmed for Piggy when Ralph betrayed the secret of Piggy's nickname to the accompaniment of the appalling sycophantic laughter of the crowd. A few things stood out to him by the time he reached the end. The flaws were first and foremost, followed closely by the perceived potential. Polishing away the flaws he felt would push the potential to the forefront. Now, the easiest to fix seemed to be the overuse of commas and Piggy's overrepresented common speech by the use of misspellings. Of a more serious nature were structural flaws, which included an interpretation of atomic war, an air battle above the island highlighted by a dead airman parachuting, and a naval battle between two opposing fleets. Now, even more troubling was the Christ-like character known as Simon. Like Christ, Simon found himself in the wilderness, in this case, a jungle. There, a God-like voice assured him of Ralph's safe return home. He also led so-called good dances on the beach. Rounding off his messianic impression, he squared up against evil, the pig's head, aka the Lord of the Flies. Well, for Monteith's taste, Simon's escapades were far removed from believable. He suggested to Golding that miraculous Christ-like occurrences should be made ambivalent, eliminated, or toned down. Now, typical for him, William Golding's manuscripts were written without regards to ruled lines, cramming as much text as possible onto each single page, as evident within the green 142 wide-lined hardcover school exercise book containing the original manuscript, which has outlived the original typescript reviewed by Monteith. Now, included with this original manuscript are red-colored sporadic notes regarding what Anne thinks. The note, 1600 hours, 2nd October, 1952, provides the finishing touch, which is presumed to be the date and time of completion. Now, the majority of the final product is present in the original. Conversations, Simon's body caught up in the sea current, strong winds rushing the dead parachutist down the mountainside. It's all there. Refined, of course, in the published version. Although Monteith found the work to be odd and imperfect, he stood firm on the strong upside he sensed for it. So, at the next Faber and Faber committee meeting, he made known his thoughts and his desire to speak with the author. Now, Geoffrey Faber had his doubts, yet he was prepared to stand with Monteith along with 2 other editors. Now, highly regarded sales director W.J. Crawley, on the other hand, was slow to chime in. It took a few weeks, but he ultimately decided the book was unpublishable. Our tense discussion arose between he and Monteith, but was put to rest by the chairman, who decided he didn't want to step on Monteith's enthusiasm. There was a condition, however. Monteith was allowed to discuss the piece with Golding, but there would be no commitment whatsoever to publishing from Faber's. Now, giving the theological tone of the typescript and never having met the author, Monteith envisioned a young clergyman. To his surprise, however, a young, neat-bearded, flannel trousers and tweed jacket-clad gentleman appeared. Now, what really made the pieces come together? William Golding was a teacher. Now, who else could be more qualified to know just how dreadful boys could be? Monteith made his suggestions for revisions, and Golding promised to consider them. Golding worked, it seemed, to Monteith amazingly fast, and within a mere 3 days sent the amended version of the beginning, middle, and end back to Monteith. He attached a letter pointing out that he'd removed the separate prologue, interlude, and epilogue, as well as the nuclear war, the air battle, and the sea battle. All were merged into the body of the text. Now, in the end, the changes went above and beyond what Monteith had hoped for. Hence, on January 10, 1954, he sent a complete draft up the publishing ladder. A month after that, on February 11th, Faber announced that they were prepared to publish the novel. Well, one little problem remained: the title. Monteith passed on some suggestions: This Island's Mine, Beast in the Jungle, An Island of Their Own, Fun and Games, and apparently his own favorite, The Isle is Full of Noises. Golding then threw in an idea: To End an Island. Now, Alan Pringle, another editor at Faber's, took a shot: Lord of the Flies. That one sealed the deal. Production commenced in March. Golding requested that the dedication, which read, To My Mother and Father, have a page all to itself in the front of the book. At last, on Friday, September 17th, 1954, Lord of the Flies was released, 1 year and 3 days after Golding sent it to Faber's. Now, though critically acclaimed, Lord of the Flies was not a runaway success in the bookshops. At the end of its first year, 4,662 copies were sold, a decent number, however, by no means a bestseller. Time would change that, as by 2015, more than 10 million copies were sold worldwide. And William Golding would go on to write another 11 novels before his death at the age of 81 in 1993. As usual, let's wrap up this episode with a quote from the animal, the savage, the human himself. Consider a man riding a bicycle. Whoever he is, we can say 3 things about him. We know he got on the bicycle and started to move. We know that at some point he will stop and get off. And most important of all, we know that if at any point between the beginning and the end of his journey, he stops moving and does not get off the bicycle, he will fall off of it. That is a metaphor for the journey through life of any living thing, and I think of any society of living things. End quote. Thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and will spread the word about the podcast. Once again, I have been your host, Jason Nemore Harden. We here at House of Words ask that you please consider helping to make this show easier to produce and more frequent by contributing on our Patreon page at patreon.com/houseofwords or paypal.me/houseofwordspodcast. Alternatively, you can like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube page and encourage others who might find what we offer interesting to do the same at House of Words Podcast. Every little bit helps, more than you might think. Until next time, keep turning those pages. House of Words is written and produced by Cristo M. Sanchez, narrated and edited by me, Jason Nemore Harden, and music by Creature 9 and Wood. All rights and ownership belong to Cristo M. Sanchez and Jason Nemore Harden.